are deeply immersed in the matter of training aviators to the highest degree of proficiency. I'd like to welcome Bill to the stage to introduce General Wills.
Good morning, everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce Major General Craig Wills to our conference today. Major General Wills is Commander 19th Air Force Joint Base San Antonio Randolph in Texas. The 19th Air Force is composed of more than 36,000 total force personnel and 1,608 aircraft assigned to 17 total force wings located across the US. He's responsible for and oversees more than 45% of the Air Force's annual flying hours program that trains more than 32,000 US and Allied aircrew annually, flying 29 different aircraft types. The 19th Air Force monitors production and oversees top-level instruction and flying operations through the Multi-Domain Flying Training Operations Center to monitor operations, manning, contracts, logistics, and maintenance trends. The training encompasses entry-level undergraduate, rotary wing, and remotely piloted aircraft pilots, combat systems officers, advanced fourth and fifth generation fighter pilots, air mobility and special operations combat crew training, all of which ultimately provides fully qualified aircrew personnel to the warfighting commands. Major General Wills was commissioned in 1990 upon completion of the Reserve Officer Training Corps program at the University of Arizona. He is a command pilot with more than 2,500 flying hours time, primarily in the F-15C and F-15E. Prior to his current position, Major General Wills served as the Deputy Chief in the Office of Security Cooperation in Iraq in Baghdad. He's held command positions at squadron, group, and wing levels and served on the Pacific Air Force's 7th Air Force and the U.S. Forces Korea staffs. He previously commanded the 39th Air Base Wing at Incirlik in Turkey, the 47th Operations Group at Laughlin Air Force Base in Texas, and the 493rd Fighter Squadron at RAF Lakenheath in the UK. He has been a fellow at Harvard University. Like us in the air transport industry, the US services are having difficulty with pilot recruiting and training throughput. And as you all know, Major General Wills is championing a new system of training pilots for the United States Air Force. I want to thank you, sir, for taking time out of your busy schedule today to address our Leaders Conference. The sourcing and training of pilots is a topic dear to our hearts, and we look forward very much to hearing how you're approaching the challenges that we're facing today. Major General Wills.
Thanks, Bill. I really appreciate everybody's time today, and it's a great honor to be in this forum. Frankly, the most interesting forum probably that I've talked to, and much different than the audiences I normally speak with. So I look forward to your questions. You know, as Bill mentioned, we have a common cause, which is to produce high quality pilots for the industry. And there's no question that we have a national pilot shortage. And I think based on what I've heard from my industry colleagues, this problem will only get worse as hopefully the industry continues to expand and commerce continues to bloom and flourish. And so I think we're going to have some opportunities to work together in the future. It's no secret that the Air Force is still short on pilots, approximately 2,000 pilots short. Overall, about half of that shortage is in the active duty, or excuse me, in the Guard and Reserves. Slightly less than half is on the active duty side. What's different, I think, about the time, we've been talking about the pilot shortage for a long time, but I think one of the things that's different going forward is the likely expansion of the industry and the fact that our training base really hasn't expanded very much over the years. And so we find ourselves in a new era, I believe, where you simply won't be able to just hire all the folks we've trained. I think collectively we're going to have to find a way to train more high quality pilots than we have in the past. So over the past few years, as we've looked at different options in the Air Force, a few years ago we embarked on a new era of innovation. And many of you have heard of our Pilot Training Next experiment. And I won't go into a lot of detail on that today, but fundamentally, the experiment was really successful, and it brought 5 main ideas. And those are the first things I'll talk about. And then I think you can see my slide on the right, and I'll kind of go around that to summarize the various initiatives. But there's 5 really big ideas that underpin the way we're looking at training going forward based on what we've learned. And the first one won't surprise anybody, and that's a quality instructor force. It turns out that of all of the things that you can do to produce great pilots, quality instruction is really at the heart of all of it. A great instructor makes all the difference. There's a lot of other things you need, but that quality instruction is really important. So one of the things we're trying to do is to continue to invest in instructor development. It turns out that our system in many ways is based on the way we've always done it. That won't surprise anybody that's worked in the same company for a long time. We have a very successful training model. We've trained tens of thousands of pilots, and we think that they're great pilots. And so as we look now going forward, it turns out that there's a lot more that's been learned about the way humans learn, the way adults learn, and we haven't necessarily harnessed all of that. So investing in the instructors is right at the heart of what we're doing. The second idea, and that's the one that gets the most press, is this idea of using immersive technology. If you've paid any attention at all to what's going on with virtual reality and augmented reality, you know that we're moving at a huge rate of speed in terms of how good that stuff is. If you haven't looked at VR in the last year, then you really haven't looked at VR. And so we think that tech is a great way to accelerate training. We're not as keen necessarily to replace flying hours with immersive technology. There's a lot of discussion about that, but our real current focus is how do you make every hour in the air better by using immersive tech. And a good example of how we use this, or I should say one of the results, we've built these immersive training devices, which, basically a low-cost simulator that costs anywhere between $8,000 and $25,000, consists of basically a gaming computer, virtual reality headset, off-the-shelf stick and throttles, and then, of course, some great software from different partners that we use. The student's ability to train in those immersive training devices fundamentally is different. When I went to pilot training, we had a poster on the wall. We chair flew. The great art of chair flying is not dead. But if you have the opportunity to get into basically what amounts to a simulator, you can train instead of preparing. And where that has manifested in the primary training that we do, we routinely see students solo in the T6 on their 5th sortie. Whereas typically over the years, you would see people solo between 10 and 15 rides in the airplane. And one of the reasons they can do that is that they've practiced in the virtual world. We've paired up with a service called Pilot Edge that you may be familiar with. So they're receiving real live air traffic control in the virtual world as they fly over the actual patterns and airspace that they're going to operate in. Using 360 video, they know what the traffic pattern references look like on day one. And so a lot of the admin that we had to deal with previously is solved before we even start. And so we start out with a huge advantage. And so immersive technology is really important. And frankly, we've just scratched the surface of it. We've just recently built an immersive training device for our T1 aircraft. We believe we're the first people to successfully use mixed reality. So we have 2 pilots sitting next to each other in the T1 cockpit. They can see each other when they look, in reality, they can see each other. But then when they look outside of the cockpit, they see the virtual world. And we think that's pretty fantastic. The third big idea is this idea of student-centered learning. I mentioned, that we've kind of done it the same way we've always done it. And fundamentally, pilot training mostly looks like this. You read about it. Somebody takes you out there and maybe shows you a maneuver. You try the maneuver. You perform the maneuver to their satisfaction. You come back and you talk about it, and then you go fly with somebody else and you hope that the first person showed you correctly. And that's mostly pilot training, right? But the idea is that through the use of adult learning models, through this idea that every student learns differently and you ought to have syllabi and instructors that can adapt to that. The idea of using a coach-athlete relationship instead of a very hierarchical IP to student relationship, we think that has a lot of merit. And we've seen, especially with the younger generation, they're a very capable generation. The older you get, the more you like to make fun of the next generation. But the truth is our kids and our grandkids are very, very capable individuals, but they are a little different. They have tremendous potential. They don't really want to just shut up and color. They don't necessarily appreciate the same learning methods we might have really liked. And so we're working hard to use a little bit of science and a little bit of art to get better learning every day. The next big idea is this idea of seamless access to content. Forever we would meter out the instructional materials to students. You weren't opted for certain material until you reached a certain milestone in the syllabus. And we're trying to change that to where the content is available on demand and on command from basically a device, whether it be an iPad or some other type of tablet, trying to build learning management systems that students can tap into and access different types of content. So there's having the seamless access to it, and then there's having relevant content. Many of us learned aircraft systems by mapping it out or drawing with colored pencils what the fuel system or the hydraulic system looked like. And I think that's a valid technique. But using the technology we have today, you can put on the virtual reality goggles, and you can stand in the middle of the fuel tank and you can watch the fuel circulate throughout the aircraft. You can watch when a leak develops, you can see the pump shut off, you can see the circuit breaker pop, and you can run through the checklist, all while you travel kind of throughout the systems of the airplane. That generally, that type of content is really good for a lot of people. So working on all of the content is really important. And then finally, particularly applicable to us in the military, is this idea of human performance. And really, it should be equally applicable to all of you. The idea that, fundamentally, we know that in aviation, most of the accidents these days are caused by people, caused by human error, and a variety of different things contribute to that. So the question is, what can we do on the ground to make sure that people are more physically and mentally capable when they get in the air? It turns out that things like airmanship that we like to talk about, if you really want to get a good debate going, ask somebody what airmanship is. And it turns out that there's a lot of things you can do on the ground to improve your airmanship in the air. And there's a lot of things that you can do in terms of the way you help people solve complex problems that we think have real validity when you go forward. So those are the big ideas, and we're using those ideas across the range of programs that we have. So those are the big ideas. Now the question is, what are we doing to increase production, and how do you maintain that high quality? So you can see on the graphic quite a bit going on. I'll start at the top. There's a blue box, and that's our enhancing our initial flight training. For years and years, we've relied on a model where we send all of our prospective candidates currently to Pueblo, Colorado, and they get about 17 hours of initial flight training and screening. So fundamentally, those are cheap hours. We fly the little Diamond aircraft, and we'd like to put more hours up front into that. So finding the money to do that's really important to our efforts. We think we can do a better job, and I think if you look at it from the perspective of providing a better baseline student when you start training in high-dollar airplanes, that's really where we're at. I mentioned Pilot Training Next. The experiment, we ran 3 separate classes where we trained students using only the T6 aircraft, and they went straight from the T6 on to big airplanes like the C5, the C-17, F-35, F-15. And by and large, that was a successful experiment. Our efforts to scale those lessons that I just talked about and the lessons of Pilot Training Next, we call that UPT 2.5. There's a long story on why we call it that, but suffice it to say it needed a name, and 2.5 is the name. The fundamental differences with UPT 2.5 is that we award wings out of the T6 program. We've completely redesigned the T6 training program. Students get their wings at the completion of about 7.5 months, and then they go on to either an air mobility fundamentals course or the fighter bomber fundamentals, flying either the T1 or the T-38 aircraft. So lots we could talk about there, and happy to take questions on it. But UPT 2.5 is at the heart of our efforts. Some other kind of innovative things we've done. If the idea was, could you train somebody using just the T6 aircraft? And the answer was yes. The next question we asked is, could we train somebody using just our T1 aircraft? And of course, the T1 is a modified Beech 400. A lot of people said, hey, you could. It's not really practical to do that. But we've run 3 separate classes so far, and what we found is you can in fact train somebody to fly using the Beech 400, and we've produced actually what we think are some pretty good pilots. It's about a 7.5-month training program. The learning curve was exceptionally steep, as you might imagine, but our students that have graduated from that program so far are doing very, very well at their follow-on training units. For at least the last 30 years, all of our helicopter pilots have finished T6s first and then gone to helicopter training. In an era where we need more fixed wing production and we certainly need high quality rotary wing pilots, the question was, could we go back to the future and once again train helicopter pilots using only helicopters? And it turns out that yes, in fact, you can do that. You have to adjust the courseware, but currently we call it Helicopter Training Next, and we've graduated, I think, 3 classes now. We're very happy with that program. That'll free up about an extra 100 pilots worth of production every year for us. On the right side of the graph, things start to get a little more interesting and depart a little bit more from what we've done in the past. One of our biggest limitations is the availability of high quality sim instructors. We rely a lot on simulators, of course, and our pilot training bases are in great locations. But places like Del Rio, Texas, Enid, Oklahoma, Columbus, Mississippi, they're small towns and not a lot of people, and I shouldn't say that, a lot of people do want to live there, but it's very difficult to have a thriving market full of skilled aviation professionals in small towns. And so the question is, could we teach a high quality simulator lesson remotely? If COVID's taught us anything, it's that we can do a lot of things remotely that we didn't think about before. The immersive training devices that we've built work, they're inherently cloud-based. And so, the question is, could we do it? And we've just released a contract proposal. I think the bids are due back pretty soon, but the idea is to have a working prototype for a T6 simulator by this time next year. If in fact we can crack the nut on this, if in fact we can hire people to teach a sim from Denver to a student that's in Del Rio, Texas, this is a game changer for pilot production. Currently, lack of enough sim instructors costs us about 100 pilots of production per year. So we're really excited about that. It also has applicability to big airplanes. We have a great training base at Altus, Oklahoma, but also a very small town. And then we've got sims in places like Korea and Alaska that sometimes it's hard to draw people to. So remote sim instruction, very, very promising. Perhaps more interesting to this crowd on the lower right, we have a couple of programs that aim to take advantage of well-trained civilians. And so the civilian path to wings, you should start to see advertisement for that soon, which is this idea that, hey, if there's a very well-trained civilian pilot out there that wants to come and serve their country, perhaps we can bring them in and not put them through every single day of pilot training. And in fact, over the years, that's what we've done. If you showed up, we had a person that showed up as a T6 test pilot for Textron, and we put them through every single day of T6 training. We're trying to work past that. We're trying to be a little bit more flexible. We've got 20 slots per year for qualified civilians starting this year, and so we're excited to see what that yields. Those slots take you only to heavy aircraft. We don't know very many civilian programs out there that would prepare somebody for fighter training, but for a big wing airplane, we think there's a lot of possibility there. And then at the very bottom right, there's this idea that we have great schools like North Dakota and Embry-Riddle and many others where we teach aviation for a living. And so could we not offer ROTC scholarships and provide that training up front? And then when the lieutenants get commissioned, provide an assessment of their skills. And then once again, potentially they bypass huge portions of undergraduate pilot training. So lots of promise there. That one's a little trickier because it requires money. And money's tight all the time, all over the place. And so we're working through funding of those scholarships. And then fundamentally, I mentioned, we call it CRAFT, Comprehensive Readiness for Aircrew Flying Training, but that's just human performance. It's expensive relative to lots of things, but it's pennies on the dollar compared to training pilots. And so we're excited about our CRAFT efforts and our human performance. So altogether, what does this mean? Some of these things are farther along than others. We've been graduating students out of UPT 2.5 for over a year. I think I said we've had 3 accelerated path to wings classes. We've had 2 or 3 helicopter training next. And so far, everything's looks pretty good, very promising. The proof will be in the pudding as these graduates move on to their formal training units and we get good feedback from the field. As you know, none of these things happen overnight. It does take time. One of the big lessons that I would share with you that shouldn't surprise anybody, which is there are efficiencies, but there are no shortcuts. The training has to happen somewhere. You put the virtual reality goggles, when you put them on your head, sadly, they don't automatically train you. They're just ways that you can train better and smarter and harder, but there are no real shortcuts. So we're very proud of all of our efforts. I look forward to your questions. I think that these things I think have potential for us, and there may be some applicability to industry as well. So with that, why don't I pause and take any questions you may have? Thank you.
Good morning, General. Thank you for being here. I'm Guy Smith, the president of the Aviation Accreditation Board International. I think I've seen you a time or two on the NPSF forum. My question for you today is about, we in civilian training think a lot about performance-based training or evidence-based training, which means, individualized training compared to rote or class or cohort kind of training. What are your thoughts on performance-based training or evidence-based training?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure, I may not fully understand the question. I would say that, our model traditionally has been kind of cohort based, this big pipeline. Now it's interesting, the Navy does things a little differently than we do. The Navy traditionally hasn't used a class structure. They have a lot of instructors, they have a lot of students sort of manage their way through the training, certainly with supervision. But for years and years, the Air Force system has been fairly rigid, 15 or 16 classes a year. And we found there's pluses and minuses with that. So one of the things, in fact, that we're leaning a little bit like the Navy here, which is as part of this student-centered learning, we're no longer slowing people down. For years, if you got 3 or 4 days ahead of the rest of your class, we would actually slow you down so that you could all move together. And now we're saying, why don't you progress at the rate you can progress? It's causing two really interesting phenomena. One is that the difference in skill level between the top of the class and the bottom of the class is actually increasing, because the opportunity for the best people in the class to get better is increasing. But the second thing that's happening is it's kind of upended our assignment process, because you can finish 2 or 3 classes further ahead than where you started, and that's just not something we're set up for. So I guess I would tell you, I like the cohort-based training from a programmatic perspective. It allows us to accurately forecast how many people are going through, but the hybrid model seems to be the right way to be for us, which may be what you call performance-based training, which is let's allow people to go faster if they can. Did I get closer, or was I wildly off the mark?
General, it's Bill White again. I just got one question, which I'm very interested in, is the transition directly into the T1 for training. That, to me, is very relevant to what we do in terms of you put the person in the right vehicle to train them on that vehicle. And I'm just wondering if you've got some numbers you can put around that. You said that it was a bit of a challenge, a steep learning curve for the individuals that went into that program. Is it much longer in terms of hours than when they went through the T6 and then onto the T1? Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Bill. Great question. In fact, the program is actually about 7.5 to 8 months in length, and in reality, it's less hours than T1 plus T6 combined. So it's about 80 program flying hours plus 40 hours mandatory in the jump seat. So one of the other things years ago, military training, we had this idea that, one of the big attributes of our system was you had limited opportunities, and you had to figure out if you could make it happen in the time you had. Well, the new way of looking at it is this is expensive. We want people to maximize their learning. We can still enforce standards, but now we try to use sandbag sorties or observation sorties wherever we can to enhance learning. So in this accelerated path to wings, there's 80 hours in the seat plus 40 mandatory jump seat hours, and then students are encouraged to take jump seats wherever they can get them. And it takes, if you compare the number of hours, it's 15 or 20 hours less than what the old T1 and T6 program combined might be. The real reason for the very steep learning curve is the fact, frankly, is that our courseware wasn't quite right. So we've been doing this T6 program for so long, we really had taken for granted how much people really learn in those first 6 months of pilot training. So in the first classes that went through, there were lots of gaps in the courseware, and then and also the what the instructors expected. So most of the learning curve was on the instructor side. What I would tell you is that what goes along with not doing the T6 is none of those students picked up bad habits from the T6. And quote unquote, put bad in air quotes. But after 6 months of learning how to use this to fly a single engine turboprop, a lot of the go-to techniques and habits and things that they knew, frankly, would set them back in the early days of T1 training. So there's pluses and minuses, but the T1 instructors actually found that the flying skills piece of it was the easiest part. It was making up for all the general knowledge and airmanship that they learned in the T6. So the other thing I would note is that we have the luxury of doing something like this because we also can guarantee follow-on training. So when I graduate somebody through using just the T1, I know I'm going to send them to a C-17 formal training unit. They're going to be very closely supervised. And I know when they go to their operation unit, they're going to have a couple of years of consistent flying hours with the highly experienced aircraft commanders. So this model may or may not be applicable to industry, but we think that this model offers a really interesting opportunity to expand production on the military side. Over.
General Wills, Fay Malarkey Black, CEO of the RAA. We really enjoyed all of your remarks. There's just so much incredible overlap between what you're doing and what we're looking at. And I know that you'll be joining us with our board of directors for another more intimate conversation later. And I think you'll get plenty more questions then. But we thank you so much for your time and all you're doing to keep us safe. Thank you for your service. And thank you for being here today. Please join me in thanking General Wills.
Thank you very much.